the style editor sits, it's kind of like a layer that sits on top of CSS. So can you kind of explain to us how all of that works and why you made the decision to build it that way?
Yeah, for sure. I'll probably go back about 10 years first.
Yes, time
It's a
warp.
long time ago. Dorian and I were building every project. We've built a couple hundred projects using previous versions of Builder for clients. And we had a sort of like our own, I don't know if it's not really a rendering engine, but our own methodology for styling. And actually, Felicia, who's on the call, built the first version of a lot of that stuff a long time ago, like 15 years ago. But it was all tied to the element, right? So it was all inline styling. And that style, like you would go to a button and you could change the border, you could change the corner radiuses and that kind of thing. And it was technically writing CSS, but you had no control over it. You couldn't like add your own new property to it or anything like that. So we kept leveling that up over the years as clients needed it. And basically we would hit all these roadblocks. You know, you'd be building a project, somebody would say, I want it to look like this. And so the only way to do that would have to be to go back to our devs and ask a developer to make a modification to some element type to do whatever that thing is. So we completely shifted away from that it's been probably 6 or 7 years ago now, the first version of Builder where we allowed access to like pretty much every CSS property. But even the one before the actual product Builder wasn't nearly as powerful as what we have today. So with that power, though, it's a double-edged sword, right? You've got a lot of learning curve to go along with that. So, and that's kind of where we draw the line, right? We want to make it easier than just writing and remembering CSS. And there's always more work to do there. But we also don't want to limit anything that you could potentially do, right? So even things that are, you know, a little more advanced, like pseudo states and things like that, you can do them in Builder. And so we've built the UIs around those, but intentionally left it fairly open. So over time, it'll get better and better. Like for instance, right now, you know, if you want to put a box shadow in there, you know, you've got to know the syntax of a box shadow, right? And I think Drew's going to take us through some of the methods that we use for finding box shadows and, you know, picking the right ones that we like and copy pasting and things like that. But those UIs will all level up over time as well. We'll just continually modify those and add to them to make them easier and easier to just style using a GUI and not have to know any of that CSS syntax. But the trick, for me at least, the trick has always been, I can't ever remember every CSS property. Like I don't know anyone who claims they can, you know, it's like there's hundreds of them and the interoperability of them causes tens of thousands of permutations. So you can't really like be 100% on all of them at all times. So I'm constantly going to Google, right? Google or Stack Overflow. Like that's the place. Go to Google, say, you know, how do you do this property? I can't remember. And then just go look it up and see exactly what it is. And the nice thing about the way we built the style editor is whatever Stack Overflow or Google or W3 Schools or whatever your favorite online you know, lookup area is, whatever it says there is going to work in Builder. If it's valid CSS, it's going to work. And that's really the premise behind the style editor. Let me show my screen and I'll just talk about a couple of things in there. And also feel free to, you know, jump in and stop me anytime and ask questions. And I do apologize. We've got the lawn people are cutting the lawn right now outside. We just moved into a new house and we're just getting it cut. So if it's loud, sorry about that. All right, so can y'all see my screen? Everyone see it? Cool. So let me just go, let's go to like this button here. So this is actually one of Michael Gill's new templates that he just published. And before I even actually go into the style editor, you know, the way to access the styling of an element is up here in these tabs and go to styling and you'll see these three sections. So primary, utility, and inline. And then external class references we can talk about in more detail. Drew, were you going to get into that in detail? Were you thinking about?
No, I mean I can if you want, but I didn't have that planned.
Yeah, I think we'll just keep it high level. I'll walk through that real quick. So in CSS, the way it works is you've got this style sheet that's actually delivered with the web page. And that style sheet has all of these properties that are inside of each style class written out just like this, right? Or in a similar format to this. So in this style sheet, you'll have basically every style class just written into one big file. And that's what Bildr produces at the end of this. So when you're styling all these things and creating classes, it actually is producing those styles into a style sheet for the execution of your project. But the thing about that is that those styles, the order in which they're in that file, determine what overrides what. So if you have one style class that says background blue and another one that says background red, the order of them in the style sheet determines whether or not, if you apply both those styles to the same element, which background color it's going to get. So we wanted to take one step away from that in the style editor. And this is one of the very few opinionated pieces we have on the style editor, is that we have this thing called a primary class, and you can only select one. The idea there is that 99% use case is you've got this class that applies to most elements, and then you can use utility classes that will always come in the file after the primary class, which then allows for the system to always know, and for you to always know, that anything you put into the utility class here, sorry, I didn't click on that, anything that you put into the utility class here will automatically override that primary class. Now, technically, there's really no difference between these two. It's just, they're both style classes. It's really just specifying the order that they're going to appear in that style sheet when it gets generated. So for those of you who understand CSS and know how that all works, that's why we did it like that. It's really one of the few places where we say, you know, just for clarity and to keep it simple for a user, because like, for instance, if you go in and put three utility classes on the same element, and then you go, but those, they might, because of the way they're going to appear in the style sheet, you know, they're going to override each other in maybe a non, you know, obvious way, right? You're not going to necessarily know exactly how that works. Now, the inline styling will always override the other two. So anything you put into inline styling overrides the others. And so that's probably like the high level way I would talk about that. Can y'all hear that?
Yeah.
Can y'all hear the?
Yeah, we can, but it's
Okay.
really not
The
that
edger?
big of a
Okay.
deal. Mark,
Cool.
before we go on, could you
Yeah.
could you give us an example of like how you would use that hierarchy? So like with a button, like you might have a button that is used in a bunch of different places, and then.
Yep. Yeah. So this is the way Michael set this up is exactly the way that I would have done this. I think it's the way that Drew does it too. So there's this standard primary button style class, and this actually has nothing in it in here. He left this completely blank intentionally. I think this might be the root or the base one that we include in every project, I think, or that's on the base ones. And he did that because you might already have this button style class in your project. And if you do, then when you import this pattern or this template, when you bring it in, that button class will be there, but then his utility class is going to override that to make it look like this. But what's great about it is if you say you had on your button class a specific font family, right? Something like that. In here, if this does not have a font family, which it does not, then that means that your project's font family for buttons will automatically apply, right? So by doing it this way, it also allows us to make it to where templates, when you use them across projects, actually take the styling of the project that you're in. So it's a really cool way to do it for that reason. And I think Drew is I think you were the first one to really push that with me in particular on the templates. Whenever you started getting in there and working on building out the page templates and building out some of those first blocks, you were saying, no, don't put anything in these, you know, because I had stuff like everywhere, of course. And Drew really took that on and did that properly. And Michael's doing it properly as well now. Now, if I wanted to, I could come in here and say in my inline, maybe I want to set the color. So I'm just going to choose color here, and I'm just going to put it to red. Okay, so that overrides the text here, but it's not overriding it for every button. The inline only overrode it for this button, right? So if I put it in line that overrides just the one that I'm putting it on. Whereas if I delete it from here and instead go to the utility class and in here, change this color to red, that changed it here because this class is applied to this button, but it is also applying that to every other button instance that you use in your project because
That
this
has
class is
that
applied to it.
utility class, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And this can be helpful if you just want to make one change and have it apply to all of the other elements. So the primary style class is a default style class that comes on every element, right? And so if you
Well, some
wanted
of them may
to,
not.
oh, okay.
Yeah, some elements may not have any class at all to them. A lot of them will, like most of them will have something here, but
Mhm.
there's no reason that it has to. Like really,
Gotcha.
you could just have no classes at all, you know, and you can still do what you could do manually and just write it inline, right? Like
Okay.
sometimes you just put something inline. So you really, it's up to you how you want to do it.
Okay, cool.
But all of our templates will for sure have all of them in there. Get this out. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, as far as high level and the reasoning for why we did it, that's really all I wanted to go through. I didn't want to go too deep because I know Drew's gonna kind of actually go through use cases and walk us through some other details and like how to go out and get things and bring it in. Core, did you want me to go over anything else in particular?
Yeah, I think I'm just curious, like why CSS? I think maybe a lot of people, if they don't know CSS, like what are the benefits of CSS? So maybe power, flexibility, that you can literally design
Sure.
anything. Could you tell us a little bit more
Well, I
about
mean,
that?
there's really no other way to style on the web other than CSS. That is the only true mechanism. But with the distinction we made and the decision we made was to not try to make a decision on what CSS properties you can add or what type of CSS you can apply. Like, for instance, the things like the pseudo states, you know, these hover and things like this. We just sort of made an open-ended UI on top of the majority of what CSS is capable of. There are some things that we don't have in here, but they're really edge case type stuff. And when we run into it, we typically go and add it, you know, so it'll eventually all get in there. So styling is in every no code or low code platform you use that's building a web app, at least CSS is going to be the end result. The question is, how much detail can you get into on that CSS and how is the CSS being applied? So a tool like Webflow, for instance, applies classes, right? So you're actually creating classes and you can apply those classes. But other tools don't do that. They do more like what we used to do a long time ago, where you're actually modifying the style. You're still modifying the CSS, but you're modifying the style on an element itself always. So what that does, it makes it very difficult if you have like 20 buttons in your project and you want to change that style across all 20 buttons. That means you're going to all 20 buttons and making the same change 20 times, right? Or some level of that, depending on what you're doing. Classes give you this ability to apply it across everything all at once. So in terms of styling, really CSS is the only method, but the distinction here would be that we just leave it totally open-ended for you. So you can write whatever you want in there.
So
And
the
we give you
user
direct
always
access to
has
it.
ultimate control of their design. And is part of that why we don't have something that's like auto center this, auto center that? I know there are some drawbacks that other tools that have that, where like if you make a change, then it'll mess everything up and it's hard to figure it out.
Well, the reason we don't have like a button to center, right? That's probably one of the most common styling questions we get from people who don't already know CSS, right? When they come in, they're saying, how do I center the text, right? Something along those lines. And the problem is it depends on the context of where the text is. So if the text box has certain margin properties on it and is contained within another container, then it'll automatically be centered just with the margin auto left and right. If you have it in a flex container, it'll do that. However, if you had the text box 100% wide, then the only way to center that is with a property called text align. And so it comes down to more than just click this button and do it. That button would have to actually understand all the context around it. And the moment that the platform begins trying to interpret that context is the moment that we begin to restrict you. Because if I'm going to get that 100% accurate every time, what I have to do is limit the types of properties you can use for the context around the element. The parent of the element has to, the platform has to know exactly how you're going to approach this. And we tried it. We've done that before. It just creates so many edge cases, and you end up with these, like, what ends up happening. We used to have like these checkboxes: center this text, or center the text inside this button. The problem was when you would do that, there was always something like, oh, well, in this case, I don't want it to do that. And back a long time ago, I would go to Felicia and say, hey, can you add another checkbox that says, if I don't want that, then don't do this and do this instead. And so you ended up with like this crazy set of properties anyways, right? Over time, to handle all the edge cases, you get 100 properties across all these element types. And so that's why when we built Bildr, we decided to just opt for going full on CSS, no restrictions, don't hide anything, don't try to make the assumptions for anyone. And instead, we'd rather teach you, we'd rather you learn how to use it. And not only because we think it's more powerful and a better way to do it, but also because those skills are then transferable. You can take those skills that you're learning by using Bildr as a tool and use them anywhere else. If you decide to go into coding or just doing front end work, or to any other no code or low code tool, even if they don't give you the same level of flexibility, understanding what's going on under the hood there gives you a lot more power.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. If anyone has any questions for Mark, feel free. Otherwise, we're gonna move over to Drew to show us all the tips and tricks he has on his sleeve for how to style stuff. But
stop showing my screen.
Thank you, Mark, because I think that helps explain a lot of the why for certain people who might not be familiar with CSS. And it can be an additional thing to have to learn, but like you said, it's invaluable because it's always transferable, so it's not wasted knowledge once you actually figure
once you
it
get
out.
the hang of it too, like everyone that I know that uses CSS, obviously there's levels to it, right? Like I'm like decent at it. I'm not great at CSS. Drew is very good at CSS. Dorian is very good at CSS. They can go a whole level deeper than what I can. What I've found is I get a set of properties that I understand really well. Once I understand how to use that set of properties and build a UI, I tend to just reuse that same set of properties. So like Flexbox is what I learned properly maybe several years ago. And so I use Flex to do most of my centering work and the way the page flows. I'm using Flex, but it's really just because that's what I'm comfortable with. And there's a lot of that in CSS. CSS Grid is definitely better than Flexbox as far as I can tell, but I have to go relearn how to do everything now,
Gotcha.
And so there's a lot of that goes on in CSS, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way because everything is so performant now. It used to be like, well, if you put it all inline, it's going to take way longer to render. I mean, you could probably put it all inline now and it'd be fine. It wouldn't even you wouldn't even notice it on most modern browsers. And so I think things are just a little different now. So I would say if you're new to CSS, there are some really great resources I think Drew's going to share. But I would say go learn a method that solves the problem you're trying to solve. Like I'm trying to build websites or I'm trying to build web apps. There are different ways to go about things in there. And then stick to that for a little bit, get a handle on that, be able to build good UIs around that, and then try to level up from there. And maybe never do, like I haven't needed to after I learned those basic ones.
I'm going to chat out 3 links. These are my absolute favorite resources for learning CSS. There's this guy on Twitter who is phenomenal. He does like drawings. He goes through the properties. He shows you what they look like when they're applied. Really easy to understand, very accessible stuff. I just love, I think he's a wonderful resource. And so there's 3 links. The first is his Twitter. The second is a link where he actually talks about like, here are the basic things to know with CSS. And then the third one is a link to his Gumroad product. It's a book. It's like a little CSS cheat sheet. And I think it's only like $1 or $2. But he's my favorite. So if you're not sure where to start, I highly recommend him. Okay, Drew, he has another collection of great resources for us, and he's going to show us how he actually does some of that styling too. So whenever you are ready.
Cool. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Brand new computer, so it's showing me weird symbols. I hope this works here.
They just got, what is it? An M1, is that what it's called?
Yeah, the new MacBook.
So,
I have to, I'm like, just did my fingerprint to allow Zoom to use my screen. Zoom will not be able to record the contents of my screen until it's quit.
Got that one. Oh, you might have to restart.
I might have to quit and come back.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be right back.
Cool. And then Mark, you got the iPad version of the M1, right? And the first thing that I got a chat from both of them the first time that they tried Bildr on it, and it was like, it is so fast.
I'll second
So,
that. I have
The M1s are insane.
at the office. Way to go.
They're nuts. I just ordered an iMac because I want to see if I can use an iMac and an iPad only now. I'm gonna go for it. I did it a long time ago when the first iPad came out. I had a PC and the first iPad, and it was awesome. I want to see if I can do that now again.
So if y'all are curious where that's going, we want you to be able to build web apps on your iPads. So that'll be exciting.
It's actually, Bildr's actually really close to it already. It's pretty much just the drag and drop. I need to get the drag and drop working on there, and the pinch needs to work properly on there.
Okay, and also looks like Chief sent another link to a YouTube of a great CSS guy. So I will also take all of these and paste them into the recording so that we can access them later. Okay, Drew, we can see your screen.
Cool. So yeah, so what I wanted to do actually is kind of like piggyback on what Mark was talking about with the, so he's saying that, you know, we kept it open. It's a harder learning curve, but it's more flexible. And so what I actually want to show, you know, it's not really about specific styles or how to design or anything. I want to show ways where if you see something on a website you like, you can get that into Bildr quickly and replicate it. And then you can basically learn CSS that way, which is a really interesting thing too. So what I'm going to do first here, this is actually Dorian's dad's website. And there's this button up here that's kind of, it's a little advanced. It's the kind of thing where like, so just to take a step back, if you just wanted to do a rounded corner on a button, you could Google CSS rounded corner, something like that. Like whatever you would describe in your head is probably going to come up with an appropriate one property that you need. You can add it to Bildr fairly easily. But for something like this, like I wouldn't know how to Google this, you know, rounded button with a white thing that slides over on hover or something, you know, like you can't really do that. So, but there's a great way to make this happen. And the other reason before I start in that I think this is a cool example is because first I'll show you how to replicate this, but this button actually has a state, like a hover state and a pseudo state. Like this white is actually, it's called before, it's a CSS pseudo state. So there's actually like a couple levels deeper into this button. And I'll just show you how to do all that. Like Bildr can handle all that. So yeah, so to get started, I'm just gonna drag a page on here and drag a button. So this would be like, this could be an existing project, this could be a new project, whatever, but in mine, it'll just be this one button. Just gonna type button, there we go. And then, let me move this window really quick. Okay. And then, yeah, so like Mark alluded to, you drop a button onto the canvas, you get this button base class that's blank. There's no styles in it at all. And what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to use that base class. And the reason is if this were a full project I'm making and I wanted all my buttons to look like this, I just want to put it on that button class, which will, in the future, when I drop the next button on, it just, it gets this button class by default. It'll have all those properties. If I wanted to do this just for this button, like this were a hero button, that's where I'd go here, create a new utility class and add as a utility class, because that will not automatically get added to every button. Although if I wanted it on another button, I just add the utility class. So for now, for this one, I'm going to put it on this button class. And the way I'm going to start is I'm going to inspect this button. So I'm using Brave browser right now. It's pretty much the same as Chrome. And I think the inspector comes by default, but I know in Safari, you actually have to turn developer tools on. It's like a check mark in preferences. But so you might have a few steps to find the inspector, but it shouldn't be too hard and you can Google it. But what you do is if you right click on any element, there's an inspect menu option here. And if you click inspect, it opens this web inspector. And so all the major browsers have this. And if you haven't used it, it's basically an essential tool while you're developing, even in Bildr. Like I pretty much have this open most of the time, I would say. Well, maybe not most, but half the time. But what you do is you can inspect any element. And so I see this tree of the actual HTML that's on my page, and it's selected on this button here, which is this button. So when I hover over here, it's highlighting it here, kind of telling you what it is. And then at the bottom, I have this styles tab. And so you can see there's like a bunch of tabs here. There's a bunch of tabs here. There's a lot in this inspector. But this button right here, these styles are the styles that are applied to it. So if I look through this really quick, element style would be inline styles. One of the things Mark talked about. Here's a class. So classes start with dot in code. And you don't really have to know that for Bildr, but it's helpful to know these kind of little details. So that's a class. These are some properties. This is a class. If I go down, this star means applies to every element on the page. And then this button means it applies to that actual tag of button. So you can basically inspect all the way down. Some of these are default built-in styles. Some of these are styles that were specifically added, but you can find everything that makes that button look the way it does in this inspector. And so what's cool about Bildr, if you don't know, when you're styling, you have this all props tab where you can do like a very visual way to find properties. You have use props, which is what I mostly use, where you just kind of search through properties here and it only lists the ones that are actually applied to that element. And then you have the straight CSS tab. So what I would do in a situation like this is I would come to this button, I'd inspect it. So now I'm selected here. And I look down and I can see there's this property and then there's all these properties. And you can kind of tell what they are too if you read them. Like I can see like border, and I can see there's a little box shadow and a background color with the purple. So I know these are the properties I want. I would just select all of these in one shot. Let me try again. It's funny, I'm actually not used to a trackpad. There we go. All right, so I copied all those styles. I come into Bildr, I'm on my button element in my button class, and I just go to the CSS tab and paste them here and hit save CSS changes. And you can see that that button right there already like styled most of the way. But what's really awesome is that now if I switch back to use props, all of those properties I just pasted are translated into like the Bildr visual way. So if I wanted to further modify these, I can just in here, in an easier way, keep doing it. Or if it's something a little more complicated, like if you don't know CSS and you don't know box shadow, you might not know how to write this or what this all means, but it's there and it works. So that's step one. And that's kind of like, I would say the easiest way. So not most things, but a lot of things don't have a hover state and don't have that pseudo state I talked about. They're just visual, and maybe it's like this font, maybe it's like this headline size I want to take. I'd be done. I'd have it styled. And then also, like I said, drop another button on and it'll get those styles like that. But what I'm going to show next is kind of the next level up. So first, there's a hover. And then because I know CSS, I know that there's this pseudo state, but I'm going to show you how to find that too. So I've got this button here. And if I wanted to check the properties on the hover, I can actually right click on the element and I can force a state. So you see these states that are listed here. The colon is how you write a state in CSS. So I can just force a hover state. And so here you can see it did the hover state and it stays, and I've got a little yellow marking here. But now if I look down here, there's an extra property added in with this hover. And so I can see it just changes the color on hover. Now, because I know CSS, to me, it would be like apparent that I don't see anything about this white background in here. And that's what would kind of clue me in that it's a pseudo state. If you're not familiar with CSS, it might take a minute to kind of find that out. But if you drop down on this button element here, the inspector tells you when there's a before or an after pseudo state on an element, and you can click on that word before and actually see properties. So I see a hover before property because I'm forcing the hover state. If I weren't, and I did the before, I would just see the before state in CSS. And you can see there's an additional, a bunch of properties that are on the before state. And what's happening in this button, in case it's not clear what we're about to do here, there's a before state that has that white background, but it's hidden. It's the width is 0% here. It's like shrunken. And then when you hover over that white background, the width goes to 100% and it becomes visible. So again,
is that what creates that slide out, Drew, where like the white slides out over the button?
Yeah. So there's two states. There's like the not hovered and the hovered, and you can think of them as like final points. So not hovered looks like that, and then hovered looks like this. And then there's a CSS property, which I had already copied over in that big group I copied, called transition. So right here, transition, that's what actually makes it, if you change any state, if you add a class or remove a class, if you change almost anything on that button and you have this transition property, it'll transition. So in this case, it's going to transition all properties for 0.3 seconds. And I think that means just the default ease and a 0-second delay. This is like a shorthand way to write transition. And what we can talk about after I finish this up is how if you are like, oh, I don't know what a transition is, I want to change that, where you can go to Google the CSS transition property and find out exactly what to write here, what you want. But yeah, that transition is actually what does the animation.
Okay.
But the transition itself won't do anything unless you're setting that before state and setting that after state. And that's kind of confusing. I don't mean this before. Go.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, why would you use before here in this case instead of using hover by itself and putting that background on there?
So in this case, that's a good question for this button, because you could basically, if I had a purple button and I wanted to make the background white, I could just use a hover state. But if you look closely, there's the white is actually inside of the button. It's not like you're changing the background color of the button. Like it keeps that border around it. And maybe there would be a way, actually, now that I say that, to have an actual border and just change the background. Maybe not, because the way it slides. But the reason
I assumed there wouldn't because of the slide. I just assumed you couldn't do it because of the slide. So
you probably can. I mean, now that I say that, I don't think you could have a slide like that. But well, you could have a transition and maybe somehow you get close. But you can't do this exactly. So the reason to use the before state, you get the option to use a before and an after, is just to keep everything contained in that button. It's almost like a little cleaner CSS. You could do something, it's not correct HTML, but you could put another div and absolute position it inside of a button or inside of another element. And you could do that same transition, but then you'd have two different elements and you'd be controlling two different classes. So it's a little bit of an advanced CSS technique, but when you get to this level and you use befores and afters, it makes your CSS really clean to create, and it keeps your HTML clean, but it makes it really easy to like modify in the future. Because if I wanted to change that transition or change something about that button, I wouldn't be editing multiple classes and multiple elements. That's basically what it's for. You could live your whole life and never use a before or an after state for sure. I mean, I would say even like a lot of people who code aren't even familiar with them very much. But at the same time, if you do know them, they're really powerful.
It was only maybe a year ago where Dorian was like, Mark, you really need to use before and after, not like put it, because what I would do is I would do exactly what you described there. I'd put another div container in there, absolute positioned, and then I would change the width of that container on hover, you know. But the tricky part about that is that what are you hovering on? Like I would always run into those kind of scenarios of like, well, this thing's 0 pixels wide, so it's not even there to hover on. So then I'm going to have to use like an action or something on hover to then change the style, and it added all this complexity to it. But I think certain, like my mindset just goes to like, well, I know I have a thing that I want to move in, so that's a new element, right? So I think what clicked for me was whenever Dorian described before and after as sort of like elements that get to be there without having to have an actual element, and you can apply style classes to it. That was the piece that clicked for me. Before that, I would do all of these workarounds with divs and actions and all this stuff to make the same exact thing that Dorian would do in like 2 seconds with a little bit of CSS.
Yep. And that's even what you described, where you would put the div in absolute position. That's actually what this before is. So if you look at these properties, it is position absolute, and then it does the width 0 and the width 100 and hover. So it's the same exact properties that you would put on that other element. You can just put on a before or an after state. The only gotcha, I mean, I assume if you don't know this and you want to use it, you might look it up anyway. The only gotcha is these befores and afters need this content property, and you can just leave it a space or leave it blank. But it's kind of a funny quirk in CSS. If you don't have that content property, they actually won't show up at all.
Okay.
So let me keep going on this then, and I'll apply this in Bildr. So this is actually a really cool thing about Bildr, as you know, a way that Bildr is pretty powerful. Let's track that. Sorry, force touch I'm not used to.
You can do it, Drew. I love
So if I
my
copy,
trackpad now.
no, I've been loving it, because my last laptop was 2013, and Mark's always talking about how he loves trackpads. And I'm like, I don't even want to use Bildr with a trackpad, but after this one, I'm like, oh, I get it now. It's really completely different. All right, so I inspected this. I clicked on this before because I realized it was there. And if I didn't realize it was there, I see this little arrow on the button. I drop it down and I see it. So they try to help you out. And then I can see in this property, it's got this selector here before. So I just copied all the properties just like I did on the first one. And now when I'm on this button primary class, on the actual class here, at the top we have device, which is for responsive, but right under we have states. And so you can see the hover state, which is, we talked about a little when you hover over, and that there's a disabled state listed here. But also I can go to this more tab and add any state I want. And so this is like a tiny quirk. I'll just mention it. Bildr adds the colon for you. So if I were doing a hover, if I wanted to add a hover state, I would just type hover. And if I want to add like active as a state, I could just type active. The before is a pseudo state, and it actually uses 2 colons. But since I know Bildr puts 1 colon, I'm just going to write 1 colon. So sorry if that's a little confusing, but I'll show you in a sec. You can like check where that happens. So I do a colon before, and I create that state. And then right here, I can check it. So right here, this selector is just telling me what it is. You can see colon before. And I don't have to change that selector at all. I just keep it in there, and that just shows me basically what state I'm on. And then, whoops. And then also, sorry to do this twice in a row. One tiny bug that's about to be fixed is when you first create a new state. So when I'm first on this before property, there's no actual CSS properties on here. But if I click CSS, it's showing me the base properties. That's actually just a tiny bug that I found, I think of the other day, but then doing this demo, I was like, oh yeah, that bug. So what I would do in this case is just add any property. I don't even have to fill it out or like switch the state, just go back. You know, I just do something like that and then I'm good. So here I can remove this random one. And then, so basically what I did, if you forget all of those little gotchas I just talked about, is as I went to the button class, I created this before pseudo state. And remember, I had just copied those properties. So I'll do the same thing. I'll go into the CSS, keep that selector property there, and just paste all those other properties. And when I save here, nothing changes because the width is 0. Like that actually, this is that white background and it's not showing, but I need it to be there so that I can show it. So nothing actually changes on the project, but now that's in. And again, I can switch back and see all the properties listed in a visual way. So now this is where the actual magic happens. I'm going to add a hover state. And so if I go into here and again, go to this button, right click and force the hover state. I look at these properties and I see the hover here. It looks like it only has this color property. So in this case, instead of copying the whole thing, I'm just going to copy the value because I know it's color. It's easy to type. Go back here, select it on hover state. I can see colon hover right here. And then I can just add that color property, paste it. So now you can see when I hover, that button text, the color is going from white to purple, and it's transitioning, it's fading. But the white background is not there. So that's the final step in this is I'm forced on a hover state, remember? So I'm showing the hover. And then now if I look at this before, there's an additional 2 properties here with 100% and a background color. I'm just going to copy this background color because I can remember with 100%. So what I'll do is I've got the default state, the hover state, and that before state. I'm going to add a new one that looks like this. Hover, colon, colon, before. Because remember, it'll put that colon in front of hover, and then colon, colon, before looks exactly like this here. Colon, hover, colon, colon, before. So I create it. I add that with 100% property. And then the other one I copied was background color. So I'll just paste that. So now when I hover over, the whole style's there. And just to complete the demo, I think it says like, whoops, I think it says free estimate. So I'll just type in the display text, free estimate. And at this point, I've got the exact button. And I don't know, you know, there might be like some additional classes or properties if it didn't look the same. Sometimes you needed to, there might be multiple classes in here you need to copy paste from, but essentially it's the same. Like this font might be a little different. But that's pretty much it. And at that point, all the stuff I just pasted and all the like code that we were looking at is converted now into like a Bildr style. So if you're familiar with Bildr and you're already working in Bildr, you're just doing what you would do anyway. You just have these pseudo states and you have, you know, different properties. And again, because that's on the main button class, if I drop a next button on, it does that same everything. So yeah, that's pretty much that as far as like how you can go from seeing something you like and then building it in Bildr without having to know every CSS property, and then also how you can actually get pretty advanced with it and you can do those states and those pseudo states. Does anyone have questions on that stuff? Or
that last piece, Drew, that you just demonstrated, like totally nails for me the reason to not use an element, at least one of the reasons, right? To use the before after instead, because when you drop that button on, you just get everything, you know? Whereas otherwise you've got to have like a block where you have the button and then the div and then whatever else is in there. Just makes it way easier. That was great.
Yes. Thank you, Drew. That is awesome. I think you had some more things to share, or can I go ahead and chat your list of resources that you?
Yeah, that'd be great. And I can talk about it to whatever extent makes sense.
Sure.
But yeah, I chatted a list of basically the resources that I use even to this day, like after, I don't know how long I've been doing CSS, but a very long time, like I still Google a lot of things like Mark mentioned, and I have a few key resources I go to.
Okay, awesome.
And also just so everyone kind of hears this as well, like when I'm looking for design inspiration for something, a lot of times I'll have just seen some, or I'm like scrolling Twitter or something and, you know, some design person I'm following just posted some awesome thing. There's a guy named Jim Raptis who does that. He's always got some nice CSS thing that he's talking about, or it's not really CSS, it's more like design and UX. But I'll go and look at what he did and he'll have like a Figma file, for instance, that has the CSS of a thing in it. And that's a very consistent way that I think most people use. Like they see some inspiration somewhere, they'll go copy that CSS and paste it in just like Drew did, but then they'll modify it to make it their own. Because usually you don't want it that exact color of purple and maybe you got a different font family, and maybe you don't want it the white sliding in, you want it to be a different color. Maybe it's a black sliding in or something. And so you kind of take these things as like design inspiration points, is how most people do it. Most people I talk to, that's how they go about it. See something they like, copy paste, and then make it their own.
Yep. And also just reminded me you mentioned that, but Figma itself, I can't show it because I'd have to sign in on this new computer stuff, but Figma itself, when you make elements in, you can view the CSS and it looks just like this down here. You can do that same thing. We just copy the whole block and paste it in the CSS, and you'll get whatever your Figma is translated into Bildr.
Sorry, guys. I think some of these links maybe aren't translating from the notes.
Oh, my bad. I probably pasted it in a weird way.
Into here, but I'll get them fixed and then put them in the community under the Bildr Hour recording post.
And I can actually talk about too, like this is like if I wanted to do that, like the links that she sent, I would say, so, well, I don't know, say you wanted to learn about background color. This isn't the best example, but you can just search like a property in CSS, or if you didn't know it, the exact syntax, you probably write it like this: background color CSS. The first links that come up almost always are W3 Schools and MDN, which is Mozilla Developer Network. Those are like what I use. I've always used W3 Schools, but lately I've been preferring MDN. But you click on it, I would say like 90% of the time, the first link or the second link, you click on it, it's going to show you some information about the property. It's going to show you like some technical stuff too, but also, and this isn't a very advanced property. If it's more advanced, it's going to show you like the choices you have, the other things it works with. So it kind of tells you everything you need to know from like a lookup perspective. If you were saying, I want to learn how CSS works, I don't think these specific pages are the best resources. But here's an MDN one. But this is so here's like, this shows a bunch of examples how you can use a color name, you can use a hex value, you can use RGB, RGBA. So this is the kind of thing where you would basically you don't have to know anything other than like, it's called background color, I can put this value. And that's what these links are pretty much for. And I would say these are the two that I use most of the time. And then for more in-depth stuff, some of the links like CSS Tricks is a great resource, and Codepen is a great resource for like more advanced stuff. So it's codepen.io.
So making the Mona Lisa out of CSS. Some of the CSS art that I see on Codepen sometimes is just insane.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't think this isn't only CSS, but what Codepen does is it gives you can see the HTML, you can see the CSS, and you can see the JavaScript of these like little, self-contained snippets or whatever. So like this image was generated. I mean, I don't know. This is a random example I picked, but this image is like generated all with codes, and you can play with it here. This is the example, and then you're like, oh, how do they make that? You can look at the HTML, look at the CSS. So sometimes if there's something more advanced, you would come to something like Codepen where there's multiple elements and multiple CSS properties and even potentially JavaScript. You can actually translate that all in a very similar way right into Bildr. So for like, if I wanted to do like a really awesome button, I might search Codepen for like, great button examples, or like even this might be a better example than that one I clicked, where it's like floating labels. You want to learn how to do this. That's not just a CSS property, but with Codepen, I see this example. I'm like, yes, that's what I want. I see how the HTML they used. I see the CSS they used. And in this case, they didn't use any JavaScript. So this is pure CSS. So that's Codepen. And that's just another great resource that I like to use a lot.
And Drew,
I forget if there are more on there.
Fraser had asked if we're thinking about adding before and after to the studio. Yeah, we always go back and forth on like what defaults to include in that list, I think eventually there's going to be a pretty large set of defaults in that list when you just go down, because there's just a lot of things like that. But what we found early on, especially with the earlier users, was that the more of those kind of defaults we put in there, the more confusing it was. It's just like another thing they have to, like, what do I need to use before? Do I not need to use before? And so we kind of like, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, we just sort of like pulled all of that extra out. I don't remember if before and after was in there in particular, but we went through and kind of did a cleansing of that stuff intentionally But I bet a lot of that makes its way back in. You can always add it manually though. Any of that stuff can be added manually.
Yeah, I think the thing about it is there's so many of these states. And even like sometimes I don't know if like Tailwind's a good example. I don't know if Tailwind does it specifically, but sometimes if you bring in libraries like that, they'll have like their own states that do different things, or like maybe your JavaScript calls something by a state. So you can do all these extra things where it's like we wouldn't even be able to put every single one into the studio because it's open-ended. It's very similar to media queries, like for the responsive. We have some devices in here, but really they're just pixel values. So really you can add any media query, any width you want. We wouldn't like add all those in, but like when I build, production level stuff, I have like, I don't know, 20 media queries, usually all different sizes that I'm using to get really granular with how things change. So it's kind of a similar situation. We try to put a few of the defaults because hover and disabled actually like are very used. All the
Very
time
common.
if you submit a form and you disable the button so people can't click it again, you can like use the disabled states, or you can do different things. So and
Awesome.
actually before I forget too, Fraser, you asked about the responsive and mobile first. The way that we have these devices here, like this is our method for responsive, and it's not exactly mobile first, it's actually like desktop first coming down, but you can pretty easily replicate mobile first. What it is all is like default, and so you design whatever you want. So if you're designing mobile first, you just design how you'd want it to look for mobile, and then at the different breakpoints, like if I hover over this, it's the screen size. So this would be like a 768 window size. These and below these styles would apply, and then landscape would be 480 and below. So normal responsive, if you're doing desktop first, you design it, and then you just, as the screen gets smaller, you add in these media queries and just override any properties. So if I change a property like that, you can see the little icon comes up. That means it's only at 320 pixels wide and below. To do mobile first, you actually would just have to explicitly put your styles on this small size and then like change them as you go up. It's like not 100% natural the way to do that in Builder, but it's totally fine. Like it would work just as well. You just have to kind of, instead of using all, you're using, I mean, you have to put the properties on all. The properties have to be on all. It's how responsive is going to work in here, but you just start on this small one, and then as you build up, change the styles that make sense as the screen gets wider. Hopefully that makes sense.
And as a general discussion on there, on building for mobile or thinking about mobile, for a long time, I would not think about anything but desktop until the very end. And that was always a mistake. I would get to the end and I'd have so much to do to go back and make it all responsive. And so newer projects for the last couple of years, now I do it as I go per page, and I test it as I go per page. So typically I have a little phone stand, and I'll actually like pull the live view or the preview up on my phone. I'll have it sitting there open, and I'll have it up on, like, I'll have two Chrome tabs open that I'm switching back and forth between. So I'm building it, I'm seeing it in the desktop view, and I'm seeing it in the mobile view at the same time. Now that's really only working with those two breakpoints for the most part, but for most apps, that's usually going to be enough. But if you really want to go all the way, you do what Drew was talking about, and you go create your own custom breakpoints in the media queries, and you add all kinds of things. Like I don't even, how many are like on the Builder website this time, Drew? It's a lot. It's,
I mean,
more
yeah,
than,
I don't even know, because what I do is I actually come in, and this is kind of a cool tip too. If you're in this web inspector, there's a little button up here that actually previews like on a device, and you have this slider, right? Force click, sorry. So I actually come in, my site's big, and I just scale it down. And as things break, I look up here, I'm like, oh, 724, I add a media query. Go down a little more, something else breaks. Oh, 518, I add a media query. I'll do that a lot. I don't do that like on fun little projects that aren't, because that takes a lot of effort. But on anything production, I'll do that because it's, to me, I think it's like an important detail to make all the responsive really nice.
Okay, it looks like we've got one more question from Fraser. Wondered if the style sheet
Oh, I see.
already having max width will compete.
I think the answer is like technically yes, they'll in a way compete, but it's you can do that in real CSS. You can add max and min widths and mix them. So it's like the one of them is going to override the other one based on how CSS works. And that's kind of like, I mean, the CSS gets really complicated, but that's like built into how CSS functions. So I don't know off the top of my head. It probably matters what order they're in too. Like if you had a max width and a min width that conflict, it's just going to pick the one. Like CSS always ends up picking something. It's going to pick whatever one, is makes sense in the CSS spec.
Awesome. Wonderful. Any other questions? It looks like we're at about time. But if anyone has anything, yeah, feel free. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and wrap today. Thank you all so much for joining today and hanging with us and learning about styling. I will post the recording later today. And then if you guys have any questions that we didn't get to, ask them there and we will answer them. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.